Picture the inside of your own skull for a second. Bone, thick and curved, built by evolution to protect the one organ you cannot live without. Now picture someone taking a sharpened stone to that bone on purpose, carving a hole into it while you were still breathing. This happened thousands of times. Thousands of years before writing existed. Archaeologists call it trepanation, and the evidence is not ambiguous. Skulls pulled from burial sites across 4 continents show clean, deliberate openings, many with smoothed edges, meaning the bone kept growing after the surgery. The patient survived. They walked around afterward with a hole in their head that their own body had partially healed over. The reasoning, as best we can reconstruct it, was almost architectural. If a person's mind had gone somewhere wrong, seizing, hearing things, behaving in ways their community couldn't explain, the working theory was that something had gotten trapped inside. Not a thought. A presence, and a trapped presence needs an exit, so you build one. What should unsettle you is not the procedure, it's the pattern. Peru did this, Greece did this, Sub-Saharan Africa did this. Cultures with zero contact, separated by oceans and centuries, arriving at the identical conclusion through nothing but independent observation of suffering? That's convergent human logic. And convergent logic is unsettling precisely because it means the mistake wasn't cultural. It was something close to a default setting. Move forward into Mesopotamia, and the exit wound logic gets replaced by an accounting system. In Babylon and Assyria, your suffering mind wasn't broken. It was in debt. You had angered a god, broken a sacred obligation, and the bill had come due in the form of your own thoughts turning against you. Priests called Ashipu functioned as investigators, cross-referencing your symptoms against archives of divine offenses to figure out which god you'd wronged. Their case notes were meticulous. Depression, mania, seizures, symptoms mapping disturbingly well onto conditions we still diagnose today. They were watching carefully, they just had the machinery backward. And nearly as far east in what would become China, physicians compiling the Yellow Emperor's inner classic were building a third framework entirely, one involving no gods at all. Your mind was inseparable from your organs. Grief lived in the lungs. Rage lived in the liver. Mental disturbance wasn't possession or punishment. It was imbalance, and the treatment followed logically. Restore the balance, and the mind follows the body back into order. 3 civilizations, 3 completely different diagnoses for the same suffering. Not one of them asked the same question twice. Cross the desert into Egypt, and the picture shifts towards something almost familiar. Egyptian medical texts describe emotional disturbance as rooted in the heart and the uterus. Anatomically wrong, but structurally significant. Mental suffering was being treated as medical, not purely spiritual. The prescriptions were herbal remedies, rest, social engagement. At temples dedicated to the healing god, Imhotep, distressed people slept within sacred grounds while priests interpreted their dreams as part of the healing process. Strip away the religious framing, and what's left is close to therapeutic environment design. A calm place and a story to make sense of your pain. Cross into Greece, and the story splits into 2 philosophies that argued for centuries. The first said madness was a message. Plato wrote of divine madness as something that could elevate a person above ordinary rational thought, a channel for truths unavailable to the merely sane. Losing your grip on reality could be less a tragedy than a kind of promotion. The second framework rejected that outright. Hippocrates argued that disturbances of the mind were physical, rooted in the brain, caused by imbalances among 4 bodily fluids. Wrong in its specifics, but the underlying claim that mental illness has a biological rather than supernatural cause was centuries ahead of its time. It would take roughly 2,000 years for that idea to become the default assumption again. Rome inherited these ideas and, as usual, kept some and distorted others. Physicians like Galen prescribed physical remedies but also treated a patient's own account of their suffering as clinically useful. An early flicker of talk therapy. But Rome also built a legal trapdoor. Under the category of furiosus, a person judged legally incapable due to madness lost all rights over their own affairs, placed under a guardian decided by family and a magistrate, not a physician. An inconvenient, wealthy relative could be declared furiosus, not because the suffering was genuine, but because someone else's inheritance depended on it being called genuine. Now, the medieval period, and this is where most retellings of this history quietly narrow their focus to one continent, which distorts the whole picture. Yes, in medieval Christian Europe, the framework of demonic possession dominated. Exorcism was a standard response to mental illness, and there are documented cases of people beaten or imprisoned under that belief. That part of the story is real and shouldn't be softened, but at the exact same moment, a different civilization was doing something remarkable with the same problem. In the early 11th century, the physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was writing the Canon of Medicine, one of the most comprehensive medical texts ever produced. His descriptions of mental illness read unnervingly like early clinical psychiatry. Conditions resembling depression, mania, anxiety, and what sounds very much like obsessive-compulsive behavior, each addressed with recommendations that included music, physical activity, meaningful work, and structured conversation, aimed at shifting a patient's mental state. In the year 1025, someone was already describing psychological intervention in something close to its modern form. And the Islamic world didn't stop at theory. It built infrastructure. Baghdad had a psychiatric hospital in the 8th century. Cairo had one in the 9th. These weren't holding cells. Surviving records describe running water, gardens, music, and physicians on staff, places designed around the idea that healing required calm rather than punishment. While that infrastructure stood, much of Europe was still performing exorcisms. Back in Europe, though, the full picture is still more complicated than either extreme suggests. Away from official theology, ordinary communities often handled mental illness with quiet pragmatism. Someone visibly disturbed but not dangerous might simply be absorbed into daily village life. Fed, watched over, known. Not cured, not treated in any clinical sense. Just included imperfectly as part of the community's shape. Nowhere shows this better than a small town in Belgium called Giel. Starting at least as early as the 13th century, Giel developed something close to a community foster system for the mentally ill. Pilgrims arrived seeking healing, and instead of institutional confinement, local families simply took them in. They worked alongside their host families, ate at the same tables, lived inside the rhythm of ordinary life. This system has now run in some form for over 700 years. It is still active today. If a mental health reformer proposed this exact model now, they'd be called visionary. A small Belgian town had already been quietly doing it since before the printing press existed. Then there's the other extreme, and its name has outlived the place itself. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, shortened over time to Bedlam, became so associated with chaos that the word entered everyday English as a synonym for it. In the 17th century, Bethlem charged the public admission to come and observe patients as entertainment. Families visited on Sundays. Watching people in psychiatric crisis became, for a period, a normal weekend outing in London. Thousands of visitors a year by some records came specifically for this. Somewhere in a society's evolution, distance from someone's suffering had grown so wide that the suffering itself became spectacle instead of tragedy. By the late 18th century, something in Europe finally began to shift, slowly and unevenly, but in a real direction. In France, Philippe Pinel is remembered, perhaps with some legend mixed into the history, for ordering the chains removed from patients at the Bicêtre Asylum in 1793. His argument was direct. Mental illness was a disease, patients could recover, and chaining someone in a cell was actively working against that recovery. In England, a few years later, William Tuke opened the York Retreat on a premise that was considered radical at the time. Treat patients with dignity instead of restraint. No chains, no isolation cells, fresh air, useful work, ordinary social contact. and the results were measurably better than what surrounding asylums were producing, which tells you something almost embarrassingly simple. Treating suffering people with basic kindness tends to help them. This was treated in 1796 as a groundbreaking discovery. But history rarely moves in one clean direction. The 19th century took the reform instinct and built enormous asylums meant to house it, and those asylums filled far faster than they could be properly staffed or funded. Facilities built with genuinely good intentions became overcrowded, under-resourced, and in many cases as traumatic as anything they'd replaced. At the same time, real scientific psychiatry was taking shape. Researchers like Emil Kraepelin were building diagnostic frameworks that still underpin modern psychiatry today. The knowledge was accelerating. The institutions could not keep pace with it. That mismatch didn't stay in the past. In the 1950s, a Nigerian psychiatrist named Thomas Adoye Lambo grew uneasy with the colonial asylum model he'd inherited, the same walled, isolating structure Europe had exported everywhere. So, near Abeokuta, he tried something else. Patients lived in an actual village alongside their own families and traditional healers, working, cooking, existing inside a real community instead of behind an institution's walls. It performed better than the enclosed asylums it was compared against. It was, in essence, Geel reinvented on another continent 700 years later, arrived at independently because the same insight kept presenting itself to anyone willing to actually look. And here's where the story loops back to something uncomfortably close to now. In 1973, a psychologist named David Rosenhan sent healthy volunteers into psychiatric hospitals. Each one reported a single fabricated symptom to gain admission, then behaved completely normally the moment they were inside. No further symptoms, ordinary behavior, ordinary conversation. Several of them stayed for weeks. Staff never identified a single one as sane. It was other patients repeatedly who suspected something was off. Once the institutional label was applied, ordinary behavior kept getting reinterpreted to fit it. Note-taking became obsessive writing behavior. A wait in line for lunch became a symptom. So traced the full shape of it. Trepanned skulls, divined ledgers in Babylon, organ balance in ancient China, temple gardens in Egypt. Plato's madness as gift, Hippocrates' madness as biology. Islamic hospitals with running water while Europe performed exorcisms. Geel unbroken for 7 centuries. Bedlam sold as a Sunday outing. Penal's chains. Lambo's village. Rosenhan's healthy volunteers, unable to prove their own sanity once a label had been stamped onto them. The pattern underneath all of it isn't that older societies were ignorant and modern ones are enlightened. It's that the most humane responses rarely came from the most sophisticated ones. They came from communities with no choice but to include their most difficult members, and from individuals willing to apply plain empathy against institutional resistance. Knowledge has always run ahead of humanity's willingness to act on it. That gap opened the moment someone first argued for removing a person's chains, and it has never fully closed since. The real question was never only what we know about a suffering mind. It's what we believe that person is owed once we know it. That question doesn't live in a diagnostic manual. It lives in whether you can look at someone whose pain makes you uncomfortable and still decide they belong.